Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
It is going fantastic today, Tim. I am super excited about the conversation that we have coming up for our listeners to enjoy. We have a couple of great guests on. We have Danny Tipping and Ned Parker. They're joining us from the UK, so across the ocean, and their company is Transistor Films, and their show on Netflix is I Am a Killer, and these two guys are great because of the way they approach these stories. They really get to the heart of the incarcerated individual. They get to the matter at hand, which is, why did this person do what they did? Do they feel remorse? And really interesting to hear two gentlemen from the UK delving into the United States criminal justice system. Very few do, and do it as well as this. And Tim, if anybody wanted to hear this episode plus all of our other episodes without the commercial breaks, where would they go to do this?
Well, our dear listeners can subscribe to Crawlspace Premium now on Apple Podcasts, or if you're not an Apple user, you can go to crawlspace.supportingcast.fm and get the same product there. You'll get ad-free episodes, early releases, and our weekly bonus show, which everybody loves.
So be sure to check out I Am a Killer on Netflix, and on September 5th of this year, the book I Am a Killer, What Makes a Murderer will be out on shelves, so you can pre-order it from your local bookstore. And as long as you're doing that and you're just tinkering around online, Tim, where can folks go if they wanted to follow us on social media?
Folks can follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod.
All right, everyone, we're going to break real quick for commercial, and we will be right back with Danny Tipping and Ned Parker. And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome to the podcast, Danny Tipping and Ned Parker. How are you both doing today?
We're good, thank you. Thanks for having us.
Lovely to meet you.
Great to meet the two of you. You are all the way over there across the ocean, and the work you've done with I Am a Killer is absolutely amazing because of your approach and how you tell these stories. But before we get to that, just a warm welcome. Thank you for joining the show, and glad to finally make your acquaintance.
Well, thank you. No, we're really happy to talk about I Am a Killer. We're really proud of the work, and we're just glad to talk about it with anybody that's interested, really.
Yeah, I'm curious about your guys' background.
Well, both Ned and I have worked in TV for a little while now, and predominantly in documentaries, but before I Am a Killer came along, when Ned and I worked together for the first time back in 2017, when we started pre-production on the first series. Well, Ned had done no true crime at all.
Yeah, I'd never worked on true crime. I hadn't really thought about it. I think I was doing kind of history documentaries mainly, and then Danny approached me with this project, I Am a Killer, having direct interviews with convicted inmates, most of them on death row in US prisons. Just a fascinating kind of offer to hear human stories. So, I mean, in a weird way, I kind of almost don't think of the series as being true crime, although clearly it is, because we don't go into the investigations. We don't really focus on the crime itself that moment. We're looking more at the individuals beforehand, what led up to those circumstances, which ended up in a murder, and then the consequences of afterwards. So kind of look at them as being human stories more than anything else.
And that's a really, as previously mentioned, great approach to telling a true crime story, is not focusing so much on the crime itself, which obviously is terrible because there's a victim attached to it, but there's the other side where you want to figure out why somebody did what they did. This is a pretty heavy topic, and getting into the true crime field, why was it this that was the tipping point for the two of you to approach, when you could have done, I guess, a little bit lighter subject matter?
Well, I think we were interested in doing something that hadn't been done before. I think there's a lot of great true crime shows out there, but there's a lot of fairly formulaic stuff as well, and things we've done before. And I think we're interested in, whether it's true crime or history or science or personal interest documentaries, that we're interested in different perspectives, and a perspective that we hadn't heard was from the killers themselves once they'd been convicted, people that admit to their crimes and have had time to reflect on them. And we'll talk about not necessarily what happened in the mechanics of the murder, but how they got to the point where they were able to take a life and how they feel about it now. And of course, that's only one side of any I Am a Killer story. Then we're intimately involved with the victim's family and people that knew the the victim as well. And that's obviously a really important side of the story to tell. So I think once we got the opportunity and we'd done the extensive groundwork and the research, and we'd built the relationships with the prisons and then the inmates and the victims' families, I think we saw an opportunity to do something a little bit different, to do true crime in a slightly different way from a different perspective. And then once we dug in, and we found there was a lot of stories, a lot of material that raised different issues and topics and took us into different areas. I think, the ball started rolling. We started getting the action after the first series came out.
The reason to go into to do this as a first true crime one is I just thought that these were really important stories to tell. And yeah, there is a lot of true crime out there, and there's some really, really good things. But there's also, I think back in 2017, there was just a lot of the kind of true crime documentary stuff was following investigations, looking at police work, or and a lot of it of just kind of painting out the criminals as monsters. We don't have any illusions that that these people have often they've all done terrible things, and often they're not particularly nice human beings. But for me, it was the fact that they are human beings, and I don't think they were being portrayed as such. We all have our bits that we're proud of in our lives and bits that we're not proud of in our lives, and it's just on a different scale with these people, but they are still human beings. And I thought that was the challenge in it, was to kind of explore these people as individuals, because these were the voices that you don't normally hear. You don't hear the one person who was definitely there at the time that a murder was committed and is still alive, and that's an important voice to hear.
Well, and the only person that can really tell you what was happening. There's a lot of sensationalism, or there was at the time back in 2017 in true crime, and as you say, the murderers were either painted as these almost supernatural monsters or criminal masterminds. You guys will know for the vast majority of the time that is definitely not the case.
I mean, we were writing to these people for a long time. It took a year and a half or so of writing letters. You can't speak to them on the telephone, so we're just sending handwritten letters back and forth across the Atlantic. And you just realize that these people were just, in many ways, normal people, therefore trying to understand what had happened in their lives to take them to a place where they would be willing to take another person's life. I mean, that's the answer. If you're going to try and understand crime, that was the part to try and understand what causes this, what places them there. And some of them are, like I say, just it's difficult to feel any kind of empathy or sympathy towards. But others, you look at it and you ask yourself honestly, if I had the life that you had up until that point, can I honestly, hand on heart, say that I wouldn't have made some equally bad decisions?
I commend the approach because, as you mentioned, like true crime is so wide, and there are a lot of investigation type shows, but there's nothing like what you guys have done. Trying to delve into these stories about how people got into that spot is just it's so important to this subgenre as a whole to hear those stories, because there are so many of those, and we don't hear about them, or they're on the news very briefly and then it's gone. It doesn't make the normal true crime news cycle. Now, what I really want to know is, how did you choose the subjects?
There's a number of criteria that we're looking for, and first of all, as Ned said, when this all started back in 2017, it was a numbers game. It was identifying people in correctional facilities all over the US and writing to them, and then there was a waiting game of getting the letters back. And first of all, they fell into two categories: those that did admit to their crimes and were willing to talk about them openly, and then those that didn't, people that were hoping to use the opportunity to talk to journalists or filmmakers to obfuscate some responsibility, or to canvass for a retrial or a pardon, or and those aren't the stories that we're interested in telling at this point, or not in this series. So first of all, that big pile of letters got siphoned down to a much smaller number of people that were willing to tell their story openly and honestly, and fully accepted responsibility.
They accepted the responsibility for taking somebody else's life. That they, it's called I Am a Killer, and they accept that part, and that they would purport to be open and honest, and they would purport to be remorseful. And I think then it's very much up to us as filmmakers, and then the viewers as well, to kind of listen to all of the voices and then decide how far we believe that. Are they truly remorseful? Some clearly are. Some, I think it's much more questionable. That was the point, to at least to kind of get into that area of why do they want to tell their story. And I think they normally want to set the record straight, or they want to try and make some sort of attempt at reconciliation, or those are really human emotions and really interesting reasons. So those are the parts we're looking for. But I think we're also always looking for cases which touched on something bigger, on a bigger kind of social issue. Again, looking at those causes of why somebody has ended up there. If you want to put a dent in the amount of violent crime which takes place, you need to understand why it's gone on. And we received hundreds and hundreds of letters of people who had truly horrific childhoods and backgrounds, lots of physical abuse, sexual abuse, drug addictions, alcoholic parents,
absent parents,
dysfunctional families. And you kind of go, well, does quite often end up being a theme, because people who grow up in really nice middle-class neighborhoods with nice supportive parents and good opportunities don't tend to make the bad decisions that the people we interview do.
Beyond that, so finding people that were willing to talk openly, if not honestly, openly about their stories. It was finding contrasting stories that, as Ned said, spoke to bigger issues. There was James Robertson from season 1, for instance, really interesting because he went into prison as a minor, didn't receive the support and the rehabilitation you might think would have been afforded to him, because he was a petty criminal that was arrested for an attempted robbery at that stage. Went into the prison system as a minor. And just got worse and worse and worse, and ended up murdering somebody whilst he was in prison to get out of the general population of the prison. And he's been in prison longer than he was ever outside. And that was a really interesting story. Kenneth Foster, again another episode of season 1, was party to a murder but didn't pull the trigger, and was sentenced initially to death before receiving clemency under the law of parties in Texas. Which is a fairly controversial law where he was party to the crime where somebody was murdered and therefore got the full weight of the law and the sentence of death. And that was a really interesting subject that I think viewers were really interested in.
Yeah, they really responded to. But there are people that we made very early on. We made the decision that there were killers that we wouldn't speak to. We weren't going to speak to anyone who was a spree killer or a mass shooter. Just the pure danger of that kind of copycat incidents.
And creating any platform for anybody that has any kind of agenda, or start whittling down cases that we thought basically spoke to the theme of the show, but also raised issues and were different in stories. And obviously, true crime. There's so much of it now, and people that are interested and really engaged with it see a lot. And so we wanted to offer something different that elevated, beyond the device of talking directly to the killer, which again was no easy task, but offers something else as well. So there's layers to it, and it raises issues about the justice system, about society.
So often some of the cases that we really, really wanted to do, and we would be in communication with the inmates, are stories that we ended up not being able to make. They are in high security facilities, and sometimes they don't behave well in there, and so getting your media privileges cut is quite a kind of a common thing. Quite surprising amount of times we would just spend months in writing back and forth, and they might decide that they don't want to do it, either because they've got an appeal or something else going on, or they've been advised against it. A lot of them express a real concern about re-traumatizing the families of their victims. Yeah, that's kind of heartwarming in a strange way that you realize, in this position, they are taking that responsibility. It makes you want to do that story kind of even more so. But there's lots and lots of cases that we would like to have done, but we were unable to, especially if we found that we couldn't, we had the inmate and the facility would have given us permission and everything else. But if we couldn't find a voice for the victim, if we didn't feel that we could present that side of it there, then it didn't fit into what we wanted an I'm a Killer film to be.
These are incredibly complex stories, and you're detailing out the circumstances that the inmates, the incarcerated, are in when they've been arrested and they've spent years in prison. I'm curious, it's always great and refreshing to get an outside point of view. You are doing this from a perspective in the UK, and you're observing criminals that are active in the United States, and then they are incarcerated in the prison system in the United States. Through all of your correspondence and your pre-production and during production, from that perspective, being in the UK, what does that look like?
First of all, I mean, it's difficult, really, isn't it? We've been doing it for 5 or 6 years now, and obviously we've sort of become intimately engaged with the prison system and the circumstances around a lot of these cases. But initially, the volume of people that were currently in prison across America for violent crimes and murders, the volume of people that were on death row in states across America was shocking to us. The circumstances that led to those sentences were certainly different than perhaps in the UK. But the stories, the volumes might be higher, but the stories of the people are no dissimilar, I guess, to violent criminals in the UK.
I think there's things which are universal. I mean, social deprivation and troubled backgrounds is a kind of a universal one, and there's lots of similarities between the UK and European penal systems and the US one. There are some differences as well, which kind of are striking. The mass incarceration, as Danny said, just the number of people in prison. I think there's more people in US prisons than in any civilization in human history, which is quite staggering. Yeah, well, the facilities have been really good at helping us and supporting us in having that access in a way that is just not possible in the UK. For example, it's if someone's on is serving a life sentence for murder, we would not be able to get cameras into a UK prison. So it kind of had to be in the US regardless. The one which we really struggle to get with is we don't have in the UK, and I don't think in very many other countries do they have plea bargaining. It's just not something which exists. And I think 97% of cases in the US are pleaded out, so they don't go to trial, and that's a really unusual situation to have. And we've explored that in a couple of the films about if you're offered a 10-year sentence if you plead guilty, or a 30-year sentence if you want to take it to trial, is that really a kind of a fair choice? Is that is that you have a constitutional right to a trial by jury? And I think that is an interesting question to say, well, hang on, you can have that right, but you might triple your sentence and never walk out of prison again. Yeah, it's a very unusual kind of setup for us. And there are various things like that which we kind of come across. Elected judges, elected DAs, that's also something which we're not used to in the sheriffs. Yeah, it's different stuff. So it's interesting.
Yeah, so I think we took to it. I think that was a challenge that drew us in, actually. One of the things we're really interested in is that let's try and get, approach it with fresh eyes, not as complete novices, because as I said, we've done a bit of this work before, but really get in, try and understand and help other people understand the complexities of the American system.
But being outsiders was really helpful in securing access and in talking to people. I think there was a view from the people in these cases on all sides of them, the inmates family, the victim's family, people from different kind of backgrounds, different ethnic groups. They saw us as being outside of the US system. We were outside observers, and so people felt this need to kind of explain it to us, which is exactly what you want for documentaries. They kind of see us as, well, you wouldn't know about this, so they start to explain and tell us, and that really helps.
Yeah, and also the other thing that I think is really important, there's no campaigning here, there's no agenda. We're not judging the American penal system and the judicial system or the circumstances that led to any of these crimes happening, and we're certainly not advocating for criminals and contributors or trying to create any kind of platform. It's about telling the most honest version of these stories we possibly can and getting to what interesting, surprising, shocking in each of these circumstances. Sometimes in the earliest letters that we received for some of the cases that actually appear in the book, the story didn't seem particularly remarkable. They were sad, they were tragic, stories, but they didn't seem particularly remarkable. But as we dug in further, there was layers to it, and it turned out that actually all the stories had a surprising a turning point or a layer to it, whether it's the legal complications or the background of the killer or how they interacted with the victim. There was always something in every case that was interesting and surprising and unique to that story. And initially we did, when we made the first 10 episodes of season 1, we weren't sure how many more we'd do or how many more we wanted to do, but letters kept coming in and the correspondence kept going, and more stories came up. More people were interested in telling their story, and more issues were being raised, and things we weren't aware of came to the surface.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
What was it like? Because you mentioned in the book that you negotiated with the prisons once you decided on the stories that you wanted to tell. What were those negotiations like?
Different in, every every facility and every state, very, very different. We approached them all in the same manner. We were very open and transparent in what we were asking for, and I think that's the only way to this is the story we want to tell. We're not going to pull any punches. This is what we need. In most instances, they want to make sure that you've consulted with the victim's family. In season 1, it was difficult because people obviously they hadn't heard of us, they didn't know what we were going to do, and they didn't know how we were going to approach these stories, how we were going to tell them, and we had to build up trust with the Department of Corrections and obviously the prison community themselves. By the time we got into season 2 and people realised that there was a level of integrity and we were true to our word in terms of how we were going to represent people, those negotiations became easier because people, we'd built up trust.
There's states that we're talking to now who I don't think would have spoken to us originally 6 years ago, 5 years ago, but I think they're aware that we're serious and we do a serious job. Each time we're looking at this and each time we're approaching new states, we seem to get a better reception, which is really good.
Did you find that most of the killers that you spoke with showed remorse about the murders they committed, or were there any other patterns like that you noticed?
There were lots of them. The majority of them would say that they had remorse. And I think that was, for me, the part which was most interesting to look into. It's that question of how much can you believe that? And I think that's a very individual assessment that for the viewers and for all of us, the team who make the films, and often we'll disagree amongst ourselves. But it's that idea that the legal system has already had their chance to judge these individuals, and that legal system has judged them, and they're serving their sentence. So we're not replaying the trial or the investigation or anything else. But it is a point that we are all taking a judgment. Is this, someone says, I'm remorseful for what I've done, I want forgiveness and everything else. And there are some there who can seem very, very convincing. But then when we go and talk to others and find out a little bit more about their case, and you find the things that they've omitted and the things they've decided not to tell you, you really do start to question it. But then there's others. I think for me, one of the films we did in season 2 was a guy called Charles Armentrout, and he features in the book as well. And for me, he was always the most moving individual. He murdered his grandmother when he was a drug addict. And it was a horrific, brutal crime. And he denied that he'd done it. And for 17 years, he was in prison and refused to admit to anybody that he had done this, and was always trying to blame one of his friends and said it was him who did it instead. And then he was in one of these prison courses, an impact on victims class, and he just had this kind of road to Damascus moment, and he just said it out loud for the first time. Said, I killed my grandmother. And from that point on, you can see that he has accepted fully the responsibility. I think, anyway, that's my personal opinion. He's accepted responsibility for what he's done. He knows he's never going to get out of prison, so there's no benefit to him.
Yeah, I think that's the important point. That's not a bargaining chip with an upcoming parole. He was 17 years into his death sentence, commuted to life.
Yeah,
and he's never getting out, and he denied it for years and years and years, to the point where nobody was asking anymore. And I think he genuinely believed it himself, and he had this epiphany, and he took full responsibility, and he recounted for the first time ever in his adult life, took responsibility for the crimes he committed. Anyway, it was a really significant film, and of course he has all the mitigating circumstances. He was addicted to crack. He was in a really bad place, physically, mentally, personally, at that point, and all these mitigating circumstances, but nothing excuses what he did to his grandmother, who at the time was really the only family member that had ever shown him any kind of compassion and care. And I think it was so traumatized. I mean, nothing compared to the weight of his own crimes, but so traumatizing, he just could not accept what he'd done. Once he got clean, he was sober, he was in prison, he could not accept he'd done it. It took him 17 years, and he went in as a young man. And he's, I think he's been in prison for best part of 40 years now.
But yeah, a case like that one, that's one where you kind of, I think you learn a lot from that, and you can see that he knows he's not coming out, but it's just about him living his life on a day-by-day basis in a facility and
living with himself.
And then there's others who are far, far less convincing. That's always really interesting, and I think it's surprising sometimes when they have their first interview. We normally interview them twice. Well, we always interview them twice, normally about 3 months apart. So we film them, then we go and talk to everybody else, and then we come back. And it's surprising sometimes in that first interview, things that they say that they somehow don't think that we're going to check on. That one often takes me by surprise. Chuck Thompson, who was in season 1, he'd committed 2 murders, and he was very much saying it was an accident and it wasn't his fault, it wasn't intentional. But he didn't think that we would check and find out that actually he had been recorded trying to get an undercover cop, as it turned out, but a fellow inmate to assassinate the key witness against him, who was supposedly his friend. So he'd really kind of put this forward, and his face at the moment when we ask him about that recording is quite something. And you just think, did you really not think that we would look at this and find that? And I think that was really telling, is that moment of, he was enjoying himself. He thought that he told a story and it had been totally bought. And he said, well, it's just not, the story you told us is not the full truth.
And I think that's what's really interesting. I think a lot of these people that have been in prison, and some, not all of them, but some of them in prison for 10, 15, 20 years, and have been retelling their story to themselves and in various counselling sessions and other, kind of mandated courses that they do as part of their prison time. And they've told and retold this story so many times. I think they genuinely believe that their version of the story. And that first interview, we always say that's their interview. Tell us the story as you see it, as you would tell it. And they do. Then we go and meet the people involved, the investigators, the friends and families, and we build up a much bigger picture of the story. And then we go back and put that to them and say, well, you told us X and we've heard Y, where do you stand now? And for the most part, that's been the sort of the real revealing part.
And sometimes the things they've omitted are things which would make you think much more positively of them. And that surprises me as well. I remember Joey Murphy, who had this horrific childhood of abuse, saying in his interview that it wasn't until he got to prison that he realised that his was not a normal childhood. I mean, he hadn't, until he got sentenced to death, he didn't realise that not everybody had a childhood with being beaten and set fire to and everything else. And you do realise that sometimes they're just not aware of where their lives are. So often them kind of referring, I just had a normal middle class background, and you kind of go, that's not a normal or middle class background. You guys haven't realised the context of this.
Until being beaten and sexually abused by drug addicted parents, and then they say, well, but no worse than anybody else, right? And it's like, no, that's that if that's your entire world, and that's it's so bleak, and violence is so prevalent from your earliest memories, that it never excuses the outcome. It never excuses the murder. There's no excusing that, and we would absolutely, that's not what we're trying to do. But just trying to understand that the human condition and how one person could get to the point where life was of so little value that they could take it for whatever reason, is, I think, the main crux of the series, really.
On the topic of remorse, do you feel that you're learning more when you discover that the person doesn't have remorse for the crime? Or are you learning more when they have come to terms with it and they have remorse? And is that even related? Even though they come to terms with it, does that even mean that they have remorse for the crime? In which circumstance do you find that you've learned more?
I think each case is different. I think sometimes the remorse part doesn't come into it. Sometimes the part which is interesting about the case is something about the legal system, the judicial system, which is there. Sometimes it's about another issue entirely. Sometimes they don't claim to have remorse.
Well, I think they all start out expressing a level of remorse, don't they?
Yeah, mostly. But I think there's a kind of, I wouldn't want to call it a kind of a gotcha moment, but there are bits when you kind of go, right, you said it was one thing and actually I don't believe you now. There is a kind of a certain feeling you get with that, but that's not the whole thing. Just because someone hasn't been totally direct about something doesn't mean that there isn't any validity to anything that they've said. But no, for me, a case like Charles Almond-Trout, that was one where I could have just sat and, we interviewed him in Missouri, so we actually got about an hour and a half interview with him each time, and so I would very happily just sit and watch his whole interview unedited. I found him fascinating to listen to, and I thought that I could somehow empathise with the position that he was in now as a 50-something-year-old man in prison. I could understand, he would say once the bell's rung, it can't be unrung, and that acceptance of his, I thought, was really interesting. So I think that's far more rewarding than catching out somebody like Charles Thompson.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
I'd love to hear about adapting the docuseries into a book. What were the challenges of making a project in a separate medium that's very similar?
For me, initially picking of the 20 episodes we'd made at the point we decided to write the book, initially was picking the stories, right, that we'd take. I think they've all got merit, and any one of them could have made it into the book. So it's shortlisting the stories that we thought had the best cross section and asked the most questions. I think we always say it's not about the questions you answer, it's the ones you ask in documentary making. So I think we're trying to pick contrasting and interesting stories,
and I think those stories which we felt that there was just more context to be given. I mean, one of the things that we have with I'm a Killer is we have a kind of that format that we've established, which is that we interview the killer, then we hear from people individually, one after the other. We don't return to people again. The idea is the experience should be for the viewer a little bit like being a member of a jury. You're hearing witness after witness, and you have to remember what it is that they've said and draw your own conclusions from it. And we think that works really well for the films, and that's why we've continued to do so. But it does make things slightly limiting. All of these people that we've interviewed, and some don't even make it into the films because of just time constraints and everything else. But it means that you're hearing somebody at the beginning, and you'll be listening to them talking about one topic, and once they're gone, they're gone. But they actually had a lot to say about a whole range of other issues relating to that case. And with the book, we felt that we could open that up by not having to have that same structure, that we could kind of jump back and forth between the killer's interviews and the contributions from other people. So it was a different way of telling that story, and I think that just provides you with more context, on a case that you might have known, or even if you don't. And I think it's really interesting hearing from people who've read the stories and then watched the films, and also from those who've watched the films and then read the stories. And they do have subtle differences in their opinions on each case.
Yeah, I think you'll get a lot out if you've watched and enjoyed the series. I think you'll get a lot out of the book because it just provides a little bit more context. And I think the other thing to say is that that obviously with Ned and I are part of a team that make these series, and over the last few years, and the producers and directors and the assistant producers and researchers have put so much time and effort into finding these people and getting them to tell their stories, and the research and all the documentation they bring together. That it in terms of writing the book, it was a gift because there was a huge resource of information that was meticulously fact-checked. And
getting the recollections from the directors on the ground once they've just been into a facility and interviewed an inmate who's a convicted murderer, and coming out and just what were their first feelings, their first impressions, because you don't get to add that sort of personal level into the films because we're just trying to present it purely to the viewer.
Working in this field for so long, especially with this one production, I Am a Killer, so many years doing this, plus the book, this must be pretty consuming for the two of you. What do you do to kind of clear your head at the end of the day?
I watch true crime documentaries on Netflix.
No, you don't.
No, I don't. No, I mean, obviously we do keep an eye on what's out there, and and how things are moving on in the genre. And a lot has happened in true crime documentary making since we started in 2017. And I think I'm a Killer is a big part of that. Actually, I think we've helped move things on. And I'm not saying that. Well, no, I am saying no. I do think I Am a Killer has helped move things on. It's a more honest, transparent, less sensationalist approach to getting to the truth of the stories. And I think there's other people doing that too. And I think, but we keep an eye. We absolutely do keep an eye on what else is out there. And but we, as I say, Ned and I. When we started, we hadn't done a lot of true crime at all, so we approached it differently. Well, why hasn't anybody done this before? So we make other shows as well. We're working on other series and with other teams making not true crime documentaries. Professionally, we're keeping it varied, and I think you have to, because they do weigh on you, these stories. I think they and the responsibility of telling them, and the responsibility to the contributors that are letting us tell the story, and most importantly to the victims and their families. For us and the team and everybody that works on it, does weigh on you. So you have to do other things. You have to mix it up as well. We've got our outside interests and our families, and we don't talk a lot about I'm a Killer when I get home.
Can you tell us about a truly shocking moment?
We know what's going to make a good I'm a killer when the first letter arrives, usually because of the reaction. We've got a sort of small core team that have worked on and off the series for a little while. So when most of our correspondence with the prisoners is still handwritten. There's some email systems in some states, in some facilities, but most of them are still handwritten. And so when the letters arrive, as they do on an almost daily basis, and you hear the envelope being torn open, and you get a gasp from one of our producers have been working on the show for a few years, and everybody huddles around the desk, and it's a story that you haven't heard before. It's a particularly shocking case, or a complex and multi-layered story that you can just know this is going to be I'm a killer. And there's there are some things that that are hard to read, I think, and and the honesty that some of the prisoners display in talking about their not just the crimes, which are obviously horrific and tragic, but also their own personal circumstances that led to that. It's nearly always shocking, and I don't think, even having done this for 5 or 6 years now, we'll ever get beyond that. And I think at the point where we open and read one of those letters and we're not moved by it, or we don't feel upset or shocked, I think that's the time we should stop doing it.
The one which I have found the most shocking, I think, would probably be Gary Black, who was in our last season 4, I think, and he it was a murder which he claimed was self-defense in a fight in the street, but quite clearly it wasn't, and he isn't remorseful, and it was racially motivated, and the victim was, any victim is innocent in that sense, and no one deserves that, but he was particularly a stand-up individual, and his parents were just two of the kindest people you would ever come across. And that just cold lack of remorse, that cold lack of caring, and the enjoyment that Gary Black had, I think, his was a shocking one. I think that was the part. He's a risible human being. There's very, very little to be able to liken him at all, and that's unusual for us. That is unusual. There is something in each of these people that you can connect with at some level, you can understand to some degree. But I struggled personally with Gary Black to find that.
What is next for you both and Transistor Films?
Well, we're busy.
What can we like to talk about?
Yeah. Oh man, we're gonna have to come back on because we have 3 series in production, in pre-production at the moment, for true crime fans that haven't been announced yet. We've finished, delivered, and on air is on Netflix is a spin-off series, I guess, is I Am a Stalker, which is on Netflix at the moment, which was a sort of sidestep from I Am a Killer, and that's talking to convicted stalkers in America and their victims. So sort of a turn of the dial on the I Am a Killer format, where we meet the convicted stalkers and then you meet their victims, because obviously, unlike the victims in the I Am a Killer cases, they're alive and they can talk about their own experiences, and of course they're two very different stories. And so that was we're still looking at how we can twist the I Am a Killer format with that first person testimony and the incredible access and the same approach and production values, and tell other stories that we don't think have been told before. So I Am a Stalker was an example of that. We hadn't seen stalking with the I Am a Killer format, I guess, and our approach to tell other sorts of stories that perhaps audiences haven't seen done in that way before.
We have a fantastic team of directors and editors, and people. We all really enjoy working together, and we all have the similar approach to looking at stories and looking for what is what's important about that story, what's the benefit of telling that story, what enlightenment is,
and why would we tell it, I guess? Why would Transistor Films do it? And I think that's the same criteria we put on I Am a Killers. Why would we do this? Well, because we can do it differently, and we can try and tell it in a different way, and maybe bring something to audiences they haven't seen before. So that's the kind of bench that we put on all all of our new projects. Will we, when this book comes out in September, we'll see how that goes. Will we do another book? Don't know.
If someone asks us to, I'm sure.
It meant Ned and I spending more time together, and I'm not sure that's a good thing.
The format is great. Repeating something from earlier on, the way you go about it is the way to go about it. It's educational, and you're trying to provide some insight into why these people do what they do, and go beyond just like the salaciousness of the crime. But your book is coming out in September, right? September 5th. Is there any place that you can direct listeners to pre-order this book?
Certainly on all your usual, without endorsing anyone in particular, but all the usual digital sales sites that are available in the States. And our publishers are source books that are via their own website, and I hope in stores all across the States. So so do seek it out. It's called I'm a Killer, and it's out from September the 5th.
Thank you guys so much for spending some time with us. This is a great conversation.